So today our special guest is the Reverend Dr. Felipe Martinez. He serves as the pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Columbus, Indiana. Hoosier town, not Columbus, Ohio. I want to make sure everybody knows that. He has many stories about the ministry that he does at that church, and he's one of the most humble persons I know. He doesn't say it out loud, but stories are coming out either through publication or things like that. So there's so many. I'm sure the one that's being kind of featured in some of the publication are not just it. So I can't wait to hear his story. And so as we continue to focus on God's abundant blessings, in our churches, well, for our peoples and in our neighborhoods, we're just so excited that you're here and you're taking the time to share with us. So one of the story, and we can lead into it. If you want to do a little bit more introduction, please do. But I was so inspired by what you did with the Afghanistan. That was a little bit a while ago, and then there's also the pay off the medical thing. That those were two major things that I was able to kind of read through some publications. But we're just open. We're here. We want to hear your stories.
Well, thank you, Francis. Thank you, Sean, for having me on your podcast, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I will add a little bit to your gracious introduction, and I will say that um, I have been here in Columbus, Indiana, now for 10 years as a pastor. Prior to that, I served in Presbytery of Whitewater Valley in as an associate executive presbyter, and in between that job and this one, I was a general presbyter, interim general presbyter and stated clerk in Great Rivers in Illinois. And I started my ministry in a small congregation in Illinois called St. Anne, Illinois, which was 1,200 people, the whole town. I'm a city kid, right? So for me, going from the big city to a small town was a big transition. But I'll tell you what, that church made me the pastor I am. McCormick Seminary may have educated me, but they made me the pastor I am. They were just very generous, very willing to have a young pastor be their leader, and I learned a great deal from them. Um, so part of what you're talking about, some of the mission work that we've been doing here in Columbus, relates to how this particular congregation really wants to have love in action and how they seek to really understand the abundance that we have as a community and as a congregation. This is a this is a an odd little town in the sense that it's 50,000 people, but it has a Fortune 200 company in it as a world headquarters for Cummins Engine here, and so it there is a small town feel, and yet there is a city feel to it. And because of that, but not only because of that, there is a great deal of generosity in the community and some abundance in financial means. And so one of the things that I seek to do in my ministry is to remind people about abundance, to think not about scarcity, but to think about how God is abundantly blessing us. And the abundance of blessing isn't material. It can take on many, many different ways or aspects. And so part of what my role is to remind us to lean into that abundance. So I'm grateful that you mentioned that early in your introduction. Um, one of the stories I wanted to share, which is the one you were sharing, was the way that we as a congregation worked to resettle Afghan families following the big influx of Afghan families that came into the country after the end of the operations in Afghanistan by the United States. And that was a really rushed exit from Afghanistan. And we have a National Guard camp not too far from Columbus, Indiana, that housed 7,200 Afghan citizens who had been
Wow.
airlifted from Afghanistan. And so this congregation I serve has a history of resettling immigrants. They resettled a couple of Vietnamese families back in the 70s. They resettled a Syrian family right as I was coming in 2015, 2016. We did that in cooperation with a church, a Presbyterian church, Irvington Presbyterian Church in Indianapolis. And that family resettled in Indianapolis. But when we got 7,200 Afghan folk in, a few miles from where we are, immediately the congregation started asking, what can we do? And so the most immediate thing that we were able to do is to collect items that were beneficial to them as they were waiting, basically, to get resettled. And so that was a very immediate kind of conversation. There was a very active member of the church who was like taking point on that. And we collected anything from diapers and menstrual supplies to toys and shoes and prayer rugs. And we helped the community where there were other people, but we were a part of a larger effort. And that family, that person that was heading the effort, started working with Rubicon was the name of the organization. I forget the full name of the organization, but they were an organization that was working to connect with people in the camp and to support them. And so she connected with them, and they were teaching English classes and cultural classes and such. So the question was, should we resettle a family here in Columbus? And so we contacted a resettlement agency, and they said no. They said Columbus is too small, and we couldn't give you just one family. They would be too isolated. I mean, we can think about 3 families, but not one. And I thought, oh my gosh, 3 families, that is huge. I don't know how we can pull that off. And what was further was that they couldn't guarantee that it would be a family that was staying right here in Atterbury, Camp Atterbury, which is where they were. And so actually, the same family that was involved in taking point to support the families in Atterbury started talking, and there was another family in the congregation who really felt the call to help resettle a family. And so we started talking, and I said, y'all, this is fine, but you understand that we're not going to give us one family. And so we started talking to other congregations in our community. And actually, we started talking to congregations that are not usually partners with us. We are a more progressive congregation, and some of these congregations we were talking to were fairly conservative. But the notion to help families who had helped our military in Afghanistan and who had helped them be safe, coming here and us sort of completing our promise, that the promise of support, was an incredible draw. And so, to cut to the chase, together with 5 congregations, with the Muslim mosque that we have in town, and some families, we were able to resettle 7 families here in Columbus.
Wow.
And that was just completely a surprise. And when I tell you resettlement, I have to tell you, because of the experience we had with resettling a Syrian family, we knew that we were in for an investment about $15,000 to $20,000 per family, because the amount of money that they receive from the federal government to resettle is very small. It's a little less than $1,000 per person in a particular family. Well, as you can imagine, that goes by very quickly. Some of the families might not, or family members might not have enough English capacity, so ramping up to get a job and all those kinds of things is difficult. So for us to really support a family for a year, to really help them get on their feet, we knew it was going to be $15,000 to $20,000, and thousands of volunteer hours to support them, because they would come and not have a driver's license or a way to drive, and our transit system is very limited, but we do have one. It's a small enough town that people can bike around, but not in January. And so there were all these other factors, and the community, these churches, really rallied, really, really rallied, So San Bartholomew Catholic Church, First Christian Church, First Baptist Church, the First Presbyterian Church, several congregations who are Latter-day Saints gathered together. The mosque, we have a mosque here in town, again, because we have Cummins Engine, there are a lot of folk from all over the world who work there, and a lot of them, there's a goodly number of Muslim folk who work there, and so they have a mosque here. So people from all over the world, but they gather there and worship there. And then some families who came together and said, we want to support and sponsor our family. All this happened probably from first conversation to first family arriving. It was 6-8 months. It was incredibly fast. And we as a congregation were one of the last ones to get a family. Other congregations that were part of that consortium were able to get a family earlier. And we were trying to involve them with one another so that they could feel like a community. I'm really, really grateful for that, because this is a community where we also felt anti-Muslim sentiment a few years before that. This is a community that had stood against Islamophobia after 9/11, and against Islamophobia at the beginning of the Trump administration's first term. The mosque was mobilizing people and inviting people. I remember they had an event where they called it Ask a Muslim, and we came into this public space, and they sat around, and people could sit around, members of that mosque, and ask them questions. We hosted one of those with members of the mosque in our congregation at First Pres. So for me, that was a sign of a blessing, a sign of hospitality, and also a sign of the possibility of understanding ourselves as a hospitable community, even when we knew that the conservative nature of this town, that was not a given, that this would work well in this particular community. This happens to be the hometown of Vice President Mike Pence. So again, just to give you a little bit of context on that. So I'm an immigrant, right? To me, thinking about the United States as a nation of immigrants is an important way of looking at ourselves. There are many ways to look at the United States, but I think that's an important one. I was born and raised in Mexico. I came to the States to go to high school and college, and then ended up going to seminary, married my wife, and became a citizen eventually. And so I feel like this is my adoptive country. And I feel very, very connected to the notion that we need to be a hospitable place, because I felt welcomed. And I think that we have a way to be welcoming when we have the right mindset to be welcoming. So that's just a short story about the sense of abundance and the sense of hospitality that can be surprising, that can be unexpected. But once we rally around a common effort, it can give fruit.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah, what a beautiful story. I just loved it. And so it must be probably back in 22, sometimes. How are the families doing right now?
That's a great question. They are in various degrees of settlement, and not all of them are in Columbus, Indiana anymore.
Got it.
One of the things that we discovered is that some of the families who were here had other family connections elsewhere in the country. So once they got resettled, once they got their feet on the ground, they were able to then go and connect with their cousin, in New Jersey or whatever. Extended family kind of connections. But it was important for us to make sure that they landed in a soft spot.
Right,
and make sure that we help them, particularly with documentation. I mean, without
Absolutely.
getting in the weeds, some of those families came with a golden ticket, essentially, a special immigrant visa, an SIV, that allowed them to apply for a green card, a permanent residency status, immediately, which is very unusual setup for somebody who's coming in from another country. They were not refugees. They were not asylum seekers. They were this
Wow.
unique kind of status. But because it was this unique kind of status, if they didn't move on their documentation within 2 years, their parole, their hold, so to speak, would end. And there's no status
Wow.
related to it. So they were not people without a country, but they were here on a temporary basis, and they needed to really hurry up and get an actual status. There was a
Yeah.
couple of families whose status was going to be asylum, but
Mm.
there were several, the majority of them had the special immigrant visa. And that was my part of my job, because I'm navigated the immigration system a million years ago. I had a little bit of a notion, and so I helped one family, the family that was with First Press, to get the application for the green card. And I did it kind of as a paralegal. I would do the work, and then I would send it over to a lawyer who was helping us pro bono. He would check it out and make sure it was fine, but I was doing kind of the legwork. And we're very fortunate that they, were able to get the green cards before they left. They left to Virginia. So the dad in that family is a truck driver, because
Right.
he used to do truck driving in Afghanistan for the U.S. forces, and so he drives a big rig cross country
Yeah.
now. Hmm.
Well, I find your story fascinating, and I'm sure Sean can talk more about it because the Presbytery San Diego is a border presbytery, right? And so they have a lot of those like services to really help people out. And so but when I think about ministry for asylum seekers, for immigrants and all that, oftentimes we think about border churches, right? Because like, oh, well, of course, right? But like you're like in the middle of the country. Why Columbus, Indiana? I just find that fascinating that it's not that things are not happening. It's whether we are going to be mindful enough or attentive enough to really go and discover some of that because opportunities are all over the place. And so that's one thing I find like just fascinating, like how God orchestrate all this. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things about that story is that they weren't doing the resettlement because of me.
Mm,
They did the resettlement, or were interested in it, because they have a history of it.
mm,
And it is handy and helpful that as an immigrant, I can be supportive in leadership. But for me, abundance is leaning into who we are already, and into who God is calling us to be and equipping us to be. So
mm.
that for me is the stories about them as a family, as a congregation, for them as a community. My role is to catalyze and encourage and challenge. And it happens to match with where I am theologically and in terms of social justice. So it's a good way for us to work together in ministry. But again, for me, it's a story about abundance,
Yeah.
where the
Yeah.
the community came together to do something that 7 times bigger than I thought we could do. Right? I thought we'd
Right.
we'd do one family, and we did 7.
Right.
And my question is that how did you get your church to get involved in this? Because we're a lot of times we go, we would love to get into these different things, but we always feel like we're lacking. We don't have the money, 10, 15, $20,000 to do this. How do we even step into this as because we often think of what we're lacking, that we can't take those next steps.
That's exactly
How
right.
how did your congregation kind of really deal through those steps?
Well, for one thing, is I think that part of what I did, part of my role in this, was I really listened when a member of the men's group, the Friday men's group I attend at the church, said, I really think we need to do something about this. I really think we need to bring a family here. I really listened, and I started to say, okay, well, this is what it would mean, and this is what it would take, right? And so when I said, I think it would take $15,000 to $20,000, he said, okay, I will raise $15,000 to $20,000.
Wow.
And just tapping the 18 or so guys that go to that Friday men's group, we got such a good head start on that the rest was just came, because people knew that they could do this, and it was a way that they could be faithful, and because it matched the identity of the church, right? Our church is not a church of immigrants. for the most part, it's a white congregation in the Midwest. We do have some people from England and some people who come from other countries, Guatemala and Mexico, and um, but for the most part, it is a congregation of Midwestern folk. Um, but they feel a sense of call to something larger, and they feel a connection. So my role is to remind them of that abundance and to lean into it. Now, I said, we didn't start with thinking about 7 families. And so that is the way in which God then takes what little we give and keeps that oil, that jar of oil continuing to produce kind of thing. Um, I feel that I want them to lean into who they are, and I wanna honor their call. And I didn't prescribe what the outcome would be. If the outcome had been, we're gonna get together with another church and somewhere else and together do one, raise money to bring one family, that would have been fine as well. Um, I think it's affirming. I think it's affirming for us to listen to the leadership and the folk who are in our congregations, and to listen to where their gifts and desires are. I keep emphasizing the money, but honestly, thousands of volunteer hours to help this family. Um, Anywhere from finding, furniture to put in that, well, finding an apartment, finding somebody who would rent to us, and actually ended up having to rent to the church because these folks didn't have any background in the different apartment buildings, were not interested in renting. It felt like a risk to them. So finding an apartment, making sure that it happened, people helping them with learning English, finding them ways to get into the schools, uh, supporting, getting the driver's license, getting the jobs, getting all these kinds of things, doing the medical appointments. The family we supported, mom and dad and 2 kids. There were some things that I had to have, some of the women of our church had to support the mom and the family because of some health issues or some questions. And all of this with very limited English. And we have no Pashto whatsoever. So Google Translate was somewhat helpful, but there's limits to that. To this day, even though we have said, you know, you are on your own now. To this day, we get phone calls and text messages from the family about what about this, how about that, how do we deal, and it's become it's sort of like being the neighbor, right? Who eh, you go knock on their door and ask them for a cup of sugar because you ran out. We're trying to be that, right? We're trying to be that group that's there and trying to understand all the different cultural issues. So the folks, the women who were helping to furnish the apartment, got him a used sofa and a used kind of a chair, armchair. And then they went to visit for something, and all of the cushions of the sofa and the chair were on the ground, had been re upholstered, and nobody was sitting on the remains of the couch. Everybody was on the floor on the couches, cushions, because that's what they are used to. This is part of their culture to sit on the ground, and the kitchen table just was there. I think it collected mail. They were eating on in this beautiful rug in the middle of the living room, surrounded by cushions, and we all were in like, okay, this is what we're doing.
Yeah, that it just again reminded me of that alone we can do so much, but together, right? Together, and then it also kind of demonstrate to everyone who's involved in this endeavor to recognize this is the Holy Spirit driving this because we couldn't imagine, right? Like from one and there's seven, and I just think it's also must be a very humbling experience for all who's involved.
Yeah, because most of the folk who have been involved through volunteer hours and such have really never had a direct contact with an immigrant family just coming in from overseas. None of us really had contacts with Afghan families as
Right.
such. And so to understand what it must be like to leave your home country under such stressful and violent circumstances.
Hmm.
People think, oh, you should be grateful that you're here in the States. And then we realize, wait a minute, they left everything.
Yeah.
Everything they know, their family, their home, their culture, you know, is that lucky? Is that blessed? Like they are completely displaced. And so we needed to honor that grief and we needed to honor that complete change. Um, and so it is humbling because we realize we are trying to help you land softly, but we know this is hard. It is humbling because the red tape in the immigration system is real
Hmm.
and it's only getting harder.
Hmm.
Um, the reality of trying to acculturate when your kids are picking up English really fast and you as the adults are not, that creates tension at home.
Hmm.
Um, the fact that if our family was having some issues with their young boy, their son, who was feeling stress and was acting out in school. I mean, right? You would expect
Hmm.
something like that with
Yeah.
such change. But mom and dad couldn't very well
Yeah.
do what they needed to do. We had to have translators to translate, interpreters to interpret difficult conversations. A parent takes pride in how their child behaves, and these were hard, and so I think for us it was just we recognized, I think, and we felt deep in our hearts how tough this was. And so we felt it a privilege to be able to walk alongside them, to support them, to temper our frustration when things didn't go like we wanted them.
Right.
Um, I mean, to temper our frustration about how slowly the adults were learning English.
Yeah.
Because if I was dropped in Kabul and I needed to learn Pashto, I would have had a very hard time because I don't know their alphabet whatsoever.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
so we try to put ourselves in their shoes and understand, and the people were gracious and supportive.
Yeah.
That's amazing because what I'm kind of curious about what it did for your congregation and the community as a whole, because it's one thing to have ideology of different things politically and so forth, but when people come in that you're like, oh, this isn't just an issue anymore, it's these people that we really are trying to resettle. I'm just curious, what does it do to your congregation and the community as a whole?
Well, I mean, I think it it um, it gave us some new partners in ministry. As I mentioned, a couple of these congregations are more conservative theologically and politically. And so for us to find common ground and, you know, work shoulder to shoulder on something this important was really helpful. I think it opens up the possibilities for future endeavors where we can be supportive of one another. Um, we recognize, I think, that we have some bridge people in our congregation. Um, Let me say a little bit about that. So our congregation is supportive of the LGBTQ community, and some churches in our neighborhood or in our area are not. And so one of the things we are finding is that some families who have maybe a gay child in their family are feeling unwelcome in those churches. And so they find us and they come and be a part of or become a part of our congregation. And what that has done is that it has made our congregation more theologically diverse because now we have somebody who grew up theologically conservative, but because their gay child, they have now begun a journey that is, taking them in a different place in their faith and understanding. But because they have been in both worlds now, we found some of those folks as crucial dialogue partners when we were trying to involve the other churches, right? So that they were able to speak from a perspective of knowing the culture of that say, conservative congregation. And we found things that were of value in common, right? So to support a family, because, hey, they're here. At the moment, we thought we were resettling somebody from Camp Atterbury, but we were saying, hey, they're here. How can we be supportive? And also, hey, they supported our troops, and we promised we would support them. So this is our chance. So we found that common ground, even if we were to articulate it theologically differently. So that partnership, or those partnerships, really opened up some lines of communication, and really efforts to see each other as congregations in seeing our ministry up close in ways that we wouldn't have otherwise, because we just think that we stay on our side of the street and that's the way it should be. And so this kind of snuck up on all of us so that we could consider the ministry that each of our churches is doing from a new perspective.
That's great.
That's so great.
Oh, and
Well,
also when we were saying we were going to collaborate with a Muslim community, with a mosque, I laid it very clearly, gently, but clearly, and said, this is not an effort to evangelize into Christianity the members of the mosque. This is an effort to come alongside and support these Afghan families who, as it happened, all of them were Muslim. So this wasn't a backdoor way for them to then, proselytize, but rather it was to find people as they were, resettle, encourage them to be a part of community that was meaningful to them.
yeah. And I think that's so good though, because you don't ever want to have some kind of agenda trying to help people with some kind of agenda,
Yeah.
right? And I think that kind of boundary probably will be helpful to get all the people to be involved. Because otherwise, for very conservative churches, or even they might not want to be in it just because, that's going to become some kind of stumbling block they can't get through, right? So,
I don't want to minimize the possibility of evangelism
no,
or
of
them
course.
feeling a good witness from the Christian churches that are
Right,
doing these things. But I also want to make sure that the Christian churches see the good witness of the Muslim community and the mosque,
right.
and that we together can learn from each other. I also think that there were some significant gifts that we each brought to the table, right? And so the fact that we were in a particular part of the spectrum of Christianity, one side or the other, whatever, it was less material, right? We could feel like we were pulling in the same direction,
Yeah,
and that brought fruit. And I mean, we needed constant meetings to stay up on the administration of things, and so that also allowed us to then create the relationships with the leadership among the churches and the lay folk. So it had an impact in opening eyes to people who might not have set foot in a church down the street.
correct. Correct. Because it's the community impact versus the different churches, right? Because it is community coming together to do this. So, well, I want to pivot a little because I want to hear another story. So, what would you like to share with? Because there are tons of stories, and I talked with you a few weeks ago, and I said, "Hey, we want to hear about this whole forgiveness, the medical debt forgiveness thing.
Yeah,
What was that all about, first of
yeah.
all?"
Thank you. Um, Once again, listening to the leadership of the church, there was a member of the church who came to me and said, I found this article in an Indianapolis paper that said that a congregation in Indiana had partnered with this organization, which is called Undo Medical Debt. Undo is UNDUE, medical debt. I think it's a play on words, right? As undoing, DOING.
Right,
Um, he said this is an organization that buys medical debt that is been discounted. What that means is that, let's say that I rack up $10,000 worth of medical debt. If I'm unable to pay it, it will eventually go to a collecting agency. At that point, that collecting agency just wants to get it off its books, just like the hospital wanted to get it off its books. that collecting agency wants to get it off its books. And eventually, if the time is right, that collecting agency will take pennies on the dollar of that debt to get it off their books. Either somebody pays for it, like the person pays for it or whatever. One of the primary reasons for bankruptcy in the United States is medical debt. So it could be that somebody who has an overwhelming amount of debt, let's say $100,000, cannot handle it, goes into bankruptcy, and then the collection agency is not going to get anything. And so what this Undo Medical Debt organization does is that it brings together, packages together medical debt, and they're able to buy it where $1 can buy over $100 worth of debt. And so that person comes, shows me this article, and I'm like, that's fantastic, right? That's really cool. And he said, my wife and I would like to give $20,000 so that we can purchase debt, but we want to do it as a church. So I want to give the money to the church, and I don't want you to tell anybody who the family is. Well, the session would know, but nobody else, right? And so that this is a church effort, and so that other people in the church could also add their money to buy medical debt. And so we did that. And so what we did is this family was in contact with the organization, and the way this works, I mean, you can go on their website right now, donate $100, and they will buy debt somewhere in the United States. But if you say, we would like to buy debt in these communities, specifically like 3 counties around us, then you have to come up with at least $10,000 so that they package all that debt together. And forgive me, I don't have the figure right in front of me, but I think that initial $10,000 bought $1.3 million worth of medical debt.
Wow.
And so what that does is that family, or those families who had that debt, receive a letter from Undo Medical Debt that says, First Presbyterian Church bought the medical debt you had. You no longer owe this. This is the account number that you had with the yada yada hospital. That's done. Here are, frequently asked questions about it. But that debt is erased. So we wanted, like I said, we had $20,000 plus some donations from members of the church as well. They're actually, it's taking us a little bit of while to spend that $20,000. So we bought the first $10,000 worth. And we'll probably have to wait about a year until they collect more of that debt so that we can then purchase it on the behalf of the people. But we wanted to make this really, really public, in the sense that if that one church member found out about it through an article, other churches, other individuals, civic clubs can also likewise be supportive. Maybe not to the tune of $20,000, but certainly they could, collect, a youth group could raise $1,000 and give it and say, please send it to people in the state of Indiana. And that is possible. It's a possibility. So we wanted people to do it. And after we did that, not because of what we did, but after we did it, we noticed there churches, Presbyterian churches around the country have done it. Presbyteries have done it. And so it's good for us to publicize an unexpected way to be a blessing, because, this congregation understands systemic poverty in a way that makes us look at the bigger picture, right? So we can look at a person who became bankrupt because of medical debt, but we have to understand that there's a whole system in play. Maybe they had a job, but it was very tenuous. And once they got that back injury, they lost their job, they lost their apartment, they lost their home, whatever, right? And so we recognize that a lot of people live on the edge. And because a lot of people live on the edge, we need to shine a light on the fact that there are systems at work that really make it very difficult for people who are trying to do the right thing to keep it going. like I said, a back injury from work could derail a family. And so if we could do this, which is not insignificant, but it feels like it's so little in the face of so much, at least those families can have that medical debt taken off of their credit report. At least that can be one step towards reestablishing themselves financially, economically in the community. Um, so we feel like that is an important way to, with a very specific action, to address a larger perspective or a larger systemic issue of poverty,
Talk about abundance.
right?
Goodness, right? You're $10,000. Granted, that's a lot of money, right? But penny on dollars, right? Like 1 point some million dollars of, medical debt. I mean, that's significant. But this point out how broken some of the system in our country, right? The immigration is definitely an issue. The other day I was hearing somebody telling me they had to, right now, in order to go to that naturalization process, they have like hundreds of questions they must memorize. And I remember when I went through it myself, it was like probably 10 or 15, right? But then the medical thing, it's like you said, could be a small injury and that would put this person out of work for a long time. And if you have family, unimaginable, like that kind of impact. So this is great story of abundance,
It
like
is,
God
and
abundance.
it invites people to think compassionately about one another, right?
Right.
Because you can think about people as a statistic. If you look at the percentage of people that file for bankruptcy because of medical debt, right? You can look at it as a number, or you can think, well, that could have been me.
Hmm.
If I had a back injury, then I wouldn't be able to send my kids to school, or I wouldn't be able to, whatever.
Right.
I think there's a sense of compassion that arises from that. Let me tell you another story. So our congregation celebrated its 200th anniversary in 2024, and they wanted to do something special to be supportive of our neighborhood, our community. Our neighborhood has some areas that are really impoverished, and we recognize that people live on the edge, right? On the knife's edge, where something small could create a bunch of problems, right? They could a flat tire, they miss work, and all of a sudden their work is in jeopardy or something like that. Rents here are really expensive for what town we are. Um, and so one of the things that the church wanted to do as part of our celebration was to raise some money to create a permanently endowed fund in our community foundation, so that it could give some money to people on an dispersed based on the earnings for things that are not otherwise funded, right? So like that, like if somebody were to say, my car broke down, $500 would fix it, but I don't have it. There's no place that goes, nobody gives that kind of money, right? I mean, a church might give you a little bit to help with something, but not $500. And so the dream was for us to raise $100,000 as a church to challenge our church foundation to match it. So 200,000 for the 200th anniversary. And we worked on it, and we got there. We accomplished it. And then I happened to be on the board of that community foundation at the time. We heard that Lilly Endowment was trying to give some money away for foundations and for other places. Long story short, we were able to add another $100,000 from Lilly. But this $100,000 had to be spent down. It couldn't be put into an endowment. So our church, the way we set this up was we were going to partner with a social service agency in our community. And we were just going to say, every year, the $10,000 or whatever that is going to come out of the fund, you take it and you use it for direct services. We are not going to be involved in this. We trust you. You know the community. You use it. And then we said, oh, by the way, here's $100,000 and you have 3 years to spend it. And so they have been busy in listening to neighbors who have those needs to stay independent, And that's really what it is. We are trying to help people stay independent or to start a business, right? Buy a sewing machine and do that one business you've always wanted to do. Um, and so that $100,000, which came out of the sky, right? Thank you, God. Um, we hadn't planned on. They're spending it. They have 26 and then 27 to spend it down. In the meantime, the $200,000 that we raised is collecting and growing. And once that's done, then they'll have that permanent income, whatever that produces, $10,000, $15,000 a year, um, just for reaching out to our neighbors and supporting them. Um, the stories I'm sharing with you are about money, but really they're not. They're about abundance. They're
Yeah.
about they're about the ways in which people see themselves in a different way and try to make an impact. Uh, you know, I'm sure that if a church, Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church could have raised $1 million, we raised 100,000. It's not really about that. It's about how it is that we can impact our community. There are stories in our presbytery of churches that have 10, 15 people worshiping there, but they have a food pantry. They're, communities that, again, rural communities, but they have a baby blanket ministry. It really isn't about what ends up being on the bottom line. It's about how it is that each church sees who they are, leans into it, and wants to be supportive. And so the 200th anniversary wasn't an opportunity for patting ourselves on the back, but it was about how can we show up, and what are they going to say in 200 years from now at our 400th anniversary? What are the seeds we're planting today that will give fruit? And so we had to think about, okay, what are the seeds that were planted 100 years ago or 50 years ago that are giving fruit today? Like our preschool that is in its 71st year. That started very humbly. We think it's a big deal today, but somebody had to start it humbly back then.
Yeah.
That was the intent of that. It's not just a checkbook ministry kind of thing, but it's really about how can we leverage what we have, impact systems, so that we acknowledge that systemic poverty is a thing and people living on the edge is a thing, and they're our neighbors. And
Mhm.
so how do we partner with them so that they feel supported right when they needed it?
Wow. I'm just like in awe of all the stories that you have. I'm sure we could probably stay here and just have you like, okay, next. What's next? What's next? Right? How many years have you been in ministry, sir?
Right. So it'll be 34 years this November.
Going
Wow.
strong, going strong.
How long in Columbus?
10 years
10
in Columbus.
years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Or
Yeah.
20, depends how you count pandemic. It
Wow.
felt like 20.
Yeah. Wow. Anyway, like I'm looking at the time. I want to be respectful. We always end by asking people what's their favorite food. I think I know, but
Oh, you
I'm gonna
do?
let you share it.
You do know? Is that what you said?
Well, isn't that the thing that we always have to get when we have meetings?
Well, that
Wow.
is one item that I really like.
Okay.
You are referring to donuts because
Correct.
in our family we have a tradition that we have donuts on Thursday morning. So it's Donut Thursday.
Wow.
That is very much a favorite of mine. But when you say food, I really immediately think about my mom's tamales. Tamales for me are the favorite thing. And some friends and our family, we've made them a couple times. I have a lot to learn, but you know what? That's a good experiment to try and just see if it works, and if it doesn't, we'll try it again.
Well, he's also an amazing photographer. I remember when you did your sabbatical a couple years ago. I
Yeah,
think you went to France,
I
right?
did. I did. I
And-
went
and-
to France and to Scotland.
yeah, because he would bring his tools, and I'm like, this is massive. Why? How do you log it around? And so
It has its own suitcase.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. It did. So just a lens. So Well, I'm just so grateful for the time that you were able to share this with us. And I'm like, well, I would love to invite you to come to our presbytery and share your story because I think those are so inspirational. And it's story like this we really need to share. We need to tell. Because it
Well,
takes a little bit of imagination. When you say it's not about money, but it's like seeing how that was able to be multiplied and multiple blessings. That's amazing.
well, for me, it isn't about finding a reproducible idea, right?
Hmm.
It's not the stories that I tell are not cut and paste stories.
No.
The stories I try to tell have to do with, okay, and when you look at your congregation, what does that look like? Where is the abundance there, right?
Yeah.
So the
Hmm.
abundance in the congregation that I served in
Correct.
Illinois, in that rural community, was, hey, let's do a pig roast and raise money for our youth to go on a mission trip. And that's what it was. And the community gathered and we ate fantastic food and we were able to go on mission trips.
Right.
Um, it's about leaning into who we are as a community and as a congregation.
Love it.
And I think it takes leadership, the pastor in the session, to really listen intently the gifts and the
Hmm.
identity of the church. And I
Hmm.
think that that's what I would say the reproducible factor is when you listen, leaning in. Um, there was a church, if I can share a brief story. There
Yeah.
was a church in Indianapolis that wanted to reach out to the Hispanic community. And they said, I was working in the presbytery at the time, and they said, we'd like to start a Spanish language service. Should we just put a sign on the front that says in Spanish, everybody's welcome? And I said, well, yes, you could do that. I said, but I'd rather you think about it as, what are you already good at and where's your passion? Because rather than shifting your direction 180 degrees, I'm looking for you to change it just 1 degree. What's what's one way that you can change things 1 degree over? Let's say you had a wonderful preschool. What would it do if you hire somebody who's bilingual? And what would that mean for the ministry of that church? And then you could see the leaders' wheels turning, and they said, well, we have a lot of teachers and retired teachers in our congregation. And so what they ended up doing was they did a tutoring program, bilingual tutoring program, not in their church, in the community rooms in a couple of apartment complexes that had a lot of Hispanics in them. That was their idea. That was their abundance. And they leaned in a way that they weren't expecting to. But again, for me, is that 1 degree over. We think we want to start something new and big, and we think we have to change everything. No, 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 just look at it a little bit different, and you'll still be going in a similar direction of where you were going, but in it propelled by perhaps a new vision.
That is so good. I
Those
had to
words
write it
speak.
down. 1 degree over. One
Just
degree over. Just 1 degree over.
that's all.
That is beautiful.
I'm going to
Wow.
use that.
So
Use it.
good. So good. I am just always in awe of your ministries and more so of you as a person, as a minister. I have such deep respect for your work and for you as a leader. And I'm like, that's who I want to be.
You're
So
you're very kind.
so, one last thing, since we're all pastors here, what is one thing that you would give as piece of wisdom or someone who's been in ministry for the newcomer, such like Carson, right? Who's going to get ready to be ordained? What is one thing you can say to our next generation of pastor?
I would think that it would be helpful to consider what your vision statement is as a pastor.
Hmm.
Um, I began to intuit this, and I didn't formalize it until later, um, in 10, 15 years into ministry. I recognized that I am a pastor who happens to teach, who happens to preach, who happens to administer, right? So I approach things from a pastoral perspective. There are people who are naturally teachers who happen to do pastoral work, who happen to preach, who happen to do that.
Ah.
So that sense of identity was a beginning of crystallizing my vision of who I am in ministry. And then I had an opportunity to take a class that really, really help crystallize it. And so for me, my vision statement is that I am a channel of God's love.
Hmm.
For me, the wisdom that I would give somebody is to kind of understand sort of at their core what their ministry is. And for me, that's it. For me is I don't produce the love. I don't have the task of manufacturing it. My job is to let it flow, not to dam it up for my benefit, not to dispense it out judiciously, but to just really be a channel. And that really connects me with who I see God to be, but it also connects me with my role. My role is to let things flow. And so I think that if I were to challenge a young pastor to think about, or a bit of wisdom to share, is to really seek to understand their place and their role in the larger context of ministry, and also where their gifts fit in all that. I think that I think that they I think that there can be moments of clarity on that, and it's not something that happens quickly. Um, but pondering it can be very clarifying for how we do ministry and how we shape our leadership.
Wow, that's so good. Thank
You're so
you.
deep. I just wanted to just spend time with you. Just talk to me.
Isn't it? Isn't it just like I could just sit and listen, like just keep talking. So,
Let's do it.
yeah, I am so appreciative and thank you, thank you, thank you for carving out this time.